Can I firstly acknowledge the hard work of the committee secretariat staff who have done an amazing job to coordinate this in such a short time frame. We conducted 8 public hearings across the state and heard from almost 130 witnesses. The committee received 777 submissions on the bill and approximately 13,100 form submissions. This has represented the largest number of submissions to any inquiry received by any committee of the Queensland Parliament to date. The bill was introduced to the House on the 8th of March, with the report tabled on the 23rd of April. This was despite the fact that with the Easter holiday period, the Commonwealth Games, coupled with some major flooding in the north, which was taking place during this period. Despite these events, a request for an extension of time was rejected. The significance of this proposed legislation on the agricultural industry was deserving of a much more wholesome engagement, and many submitters expressed their anger and disappointment at this constrained timeframe, both online and at the public hearings across the state. The committee held public hearings in Brisbane, including a video teleconference to Bundaberg, and also travelled to locations across Queensland to hear from affected groups and individuals at regional hearings in Rockhampton, Townsville, Cloncurry, Longreach, Charleville and Cairns. The committee encountered impressive receptions at each regional hearing, with consistent crowds of over 150 interested members of the public in attendance and over 400 present at the public audience in Rockhampton and Charleville. Whilst in Cloncurry, the committee undertook a site visit to local cattle properties to view and discuss vegetation management challenges, techniques, principles and approaches, with great assistance from Cloncurry Mayor Councillor Greg Campbell, which I thank him for. But despite all of this, I'm very disappointed that the final report of the committee did not recommend any amendments to this legislation. But instead, this side of the House has had to submit amendments to those most affected that those most affected have asked for. For example, in Cairns, many of these present have travelled substantial distances to attend the proceedings and share their experiences and perspectives with this committee. For example, in Cairns, Mr Justin McDonald revealed he had driven 1,400 kilometres, spent 6 hours on a plane, and he was going to spend 2 nights sleeping in a swag beside his car before he got home. Mr Luke Quartermain stated that his wife and he and his 5-month-old baby had to swim 2 rivers and boat across one other to get there for that hearing. And in Longreach, Mrs Robin Simmons told the committee she had driven over 10 hours so she could have her say. The explanatory notes advise that stakeholders have not been specifically consulted on the bill. This was a source of concern amongst many of the groups and organisations who provided evidence to the committee. A large number of local councils, businesses and landholders expressed their disappointment at being left out, of having their voice excluded from the bill's development, despite the fact that they will be the ones impacted by the changes it proposes. Locally in Bundaberg, while I consulted with peak body industries such as Bundaberg Cane Growers Chair Alan Dingle and Bundaberg Fruit and Vegetable Growers Chair Alan Mahoney and Managing Director Bree Grimer, I heard similar concerns about the lack of consultation with these affected groups. The BFVG's concerns were the negative impacts to their members with the removal of the high-value ag and irrigated high-value ag provisions, and also the thinning guidelines. Ms Grimer advised that an objective, evidence-based approach was required to deliver a sustainable solution for industry, and as a collective they are keen to observe the economics that support the bill, but we have none. Similarly, the Bundaberg cane growers had concerns with the removal of the provisions for high-value ag and irrigated high-value ag provisions for their members, along with consequences of the expansion of Category R and Category C provisions to the Burnett-Mary regional catchment, the issues of urban creep removing good quality agricultural land, and the consequences of this legislation on the biofuels future for Queensland. The Queensland Law Society submitted that consultation would have been welcomed by all affected stakeholders, given the sensitive nature of this legislation and the significant public debate on the issues during 2016. The Queensland Farmers Federation and Local Government Association of Queensland further called for a regulatory impact statement process to be undertaken prior to the approval of the bill to enable a comprehensive understanding of the environmental, social and economic impacts across all Queensland communities. Currently, high-value ag and irrigated high-value ag clearing applications must meet defined criteria prior to the landholder applying for a development approval. The bill will remove the ability to apply for a development approval for clearing for high-value and irrigated high-value ag by removing it from among the list of relevant purposes for clearing under the Act. At the public hearing in Cloncurry, Flinders Shire Council Mayor Councillor Jane McNamara told the committee, with horticulture, 1 acre or whatever that is in hectares, basically equates to one full-time job. If you put in 100 acres of anything that is high-value agriculture related, that is an extra 100 jobs for Hughenden itself. The flow-on effect then into schools, education, health, the whole atmosphere for the area changes. North Queensland landholders and Indigenous organisations also highlighted that many of the expressed concerns were intensified for those on state and Aboriginal land tenures on Cape York, where approximately 98% of the land is covered by remnant vegetation. The Cape York Land Council Aboriginal Corporation and Balcoona Cape York Development Corporation argued that the amendments proposed unfair and unreasonable constraints on development that will perpetuate Aboriginal and social economic disadvantage across Cape York. This isn't the LNP saying this, Mr Chair. This is people in the community. This is an unfair impediment on a region which is already struggling with very high levels of unemployment and low levels of economic activity. Several representatives even called this legislation poison law for their communities. And it's not just poison law for the North, it's also poison law for my community and all other members' communities in the state. Affected landholders, local governments and natural resource management groups also stated the amendments would serve to further restrict development in their catchment areas, with impacts on farming capacity and production. For example, Councillor Rob Riddell from the North Burnett Regional Council stated, "If you have a look at an overlay map of our North Burnett area, you'll see that we have one of the most extensive river and creek systems throughout Queensland. Category R is going to have a huge effect on how much viable land we have and how those waterways can be accessed." The Central Burnett Land Care Incorporation similarly emphasised that in the Burnett River catchment, many farming enterprises rely on creek and river flats for their best agricultural production, with the sugarcane and horticultural industries in particular likely to be severely affected. The proposed Section 38 provisions for entry without a warrant. It's noted that the trigger to exercise the power to enter a place is that an authorised officer believes on reasonable grounds a vegetation clearing offence is happening or has happened at a place. Queensland Law Society queries whether, in many cases, this reasonable grounds belief would be sufficient grounds for a magistrate to even issue a warrant. The QLS considers the most appropriate course is to obtain a warrant, given that it is a fundamental legislative principle that legislation confers power to enter premises and search for or seize documents or other property only with a warrant issued by a judge or other judicial officer. Police officers have powers under the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act to conduct investigations into certain offences. But under the PPRA, police do have a power to enter a place without a warrant. However, police officers then have to apply to a magistrate as soon as reasonably practical after exercising that power for a post-search approval order to have the entry and any evidence seized authorised as if a warrant was obtained. This legislation does not have that. If Section 30A is to remain, a similar post-search approval order should be included in the section to have the entry and seizure of any evidence approved by a magistrate. I'll finish with the many reasons this legislation should not be passed. The lack of any meaningful consultation with industry groups and the broader community that the laws directly impact. The government has failed to complete cost analysis or regulatory impact statement on the economic and social impacts on regional Queensland. The justification used for the removal of high-value ag and irrigated high-value ag from the Act has been ill-informed and inconclusive. These provisions were already the most regulated part of the Vegetation Management Act, and from evidence presented to the committee put in doubt the basis for its removal. The inclusion of regrowth that has not been cleared for 15 years will lock up over 862,000 hectares of land into the high-value regrowth classification. The exclusion of area management plans, which provide for an alternative approval system for vegetation clearing, in particular regional ecosystems. The proposed accepted development vegetation clearing code managing fodder for harvesting for drought management is unworkable, particularly in the mulga lands. And the proposed accepted development vegetation clearing code for managing thickened vegetation is impractical and unworkable. The expanded powers of entry give departmental officers powers that even police do not have. The proven inaccuracy of the mapping. By SLAT's own admission, there is no mapping of regrowth. This legislation has been introduced using SLAT's data which fails to be based upon science. To not base this legislation on science fails to tell the whole story around vegetation in Queensland. Members, we need to vote this legislation down for the sake of our farming families' futures.
Hear, hear.
I call a member for Buderim.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise today to speak to the Vegetation Management and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 20